Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome to everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Um, Thank you for joining us for this really important event, Ours to Tell, Ethics of Research in Indigenous Communities and Japanese Canadian Communities. I am Takashi Fujitani. I'm the director of the Dr. David Chu Program in Asia Pacific Studies, and we're elated to be a primary sponsor of this event, along with the Toronto chapter of the National Association of Japanese Canadians. Before proceeding any further, however, I want to acknowledge that the true hosts of this gathering are the indigenous peoples of this area. For several millennia, the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River have inhabited and protected this land. Today, this area remains home to many indigenous people from across the continent, and we're grateful to them for the opportunity to gather together here, to live in friendship, to work, to educate one another, and above all, to hold ourselves responsible and accountable. I also want to thank the many co-sponsors of the event. Within the University of Toronto, we thank the Center for Indigenous Studies, the Asian Institute, Canadian Studies, Asian Canadians and Asian Canadian Studies. The NAJC has also received support from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and Sun Life, and I believe President Kobayashi will have more to say about that in a moment. The event today has a special meaning for me on a personal as well as professional level. I did not grow up as Japanese Canadian, but as Japanese American. And although my parents were not interned, I was raised in a Japanese American community in Berkeley, California in the 1960s and 70s. I was surrounded by parents and grandparents of kids in my generation who had been forced out of their homes and incarcerated in camps in the interior of the country. Yet amazingly, when we were children and even teenagers, we heard almost nothing about internment, even though that experience had been only 15 to 20 years in the past. Scholars have commented on the pervasiveness of this silence before the redress movement, and they've explained that the reticence was a reflection of both the trauma experienced by the intern generation and the desire of Nisei parents to protect their children from this knowledge. A desire, in other words, to shield their children from intergenerational trauma. So when I was invited by Lynn Kobayashi to join a team to plan this event, I was only too eager to accept. Along the way, I've been learning about the Japanese Canadian experience and have been discovering that if such a thing could be imagined, the Japanese Canadian experience of forced removal and incarceration was probably even worse than that experienced by Japanese Americans in several ways, including the length of internment and exclusion from the West Coast, the outright theft of property, the refusal to provide even the basic necessities of life, which meant in many cases letting people die, and involuntary deportation after the war. Despite the differences between the Japanese American and Japanese Canadian experiences, I recognize the shared importance and urgency of the conversation that we will be having today. It is so vital, I believe, not only to prevent these experiences from being forgotten or sidelined as minor mistakes in an otherwise glorious national history, but also to make it possible for the voices of those from the community to be heard and recognized. We should never equate the experience of Indigenous peoples in Canada with those of Japanese Canadians. But the planners of this event strongly believe that Japanese Canadians and other racialized populations have a great deal to learn from our Indigenous colleagues, both within the academic setting and in our communities. So I want to especially thank Professor Margaret Kovach for taking the time to join us, to educate us in one of her areas of specialty, the ethics of research in Indigenous communities. I want to also thank the entire team who planned the event and of course all the participants here today and also virtually. I don't have time to name all the staff at U of T, but I want to give special recognition to Dasha Kuznetsova, who worked tirelessly to fulfill our many usually unreasonable and often last minute requests. It's kind of a miracle actually that we're all here at this moment, and it's all due to her. Um, Also, a few words about Lynn Deutsche Kobayashi, who is president of the Greater Toronto chapter of the NAJC. She provided both the spark and drive to see this project through from the beginning up to where we are right now. But we should not be surprised, since she has devoted so much of her life to community building and working in numerous and diverse nonprofit settings in education, healthcare, and community services, including leadership efforts on behalf of AIDS orphans in Ethiopia and sponsorship of Syrian refugees. Finally, I want to thank all those in the in-person and virtual audience today for taking the time out to join in this really important and I hope beneficial conversation today. So I'm going to now pass the mic over to Lynn.
Thank you, Tak, for those kind and meaningful words. Your support and that of the University of Toronto embodies the way universities can work with communities to tell a better story. I just wanted to highlight that present today is Setsko Thurlow, a member of the Order of Canada and recipient of an honorary doctorate from U of T. Setsko, if you don't mind standing for a minute. She has been a tireless advocate for peace and a nuclear weapons ban. She's a survivor of the Hiroshima atomic bombing, and she was chosen to accept the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So we are honored to have you here today, Setsko, and I want to thank all our in-person and online attendees for joining us today. The injustices endured by Japanese Canadians from 1942 to 1949 were an extreme manifestation of anti-Asian racism. I am a Sansei, third generation Japanese Canadian, with great-grandparents who came to Canada in 1900. My parents and some of my great aunts and uncles were born in Canada. My mother was 11 when her father was sent to a forced labor camp. She and her family were incarcerated at the Tashmi internment camp. My father had to drop out of school in grade 8 and faced hardships with his family at a so-called self-supporting site where his 6-year-old sister developed scurvy. Both families were forcibly uprooted for a second time to Montreal. They had hoped to resettle in Toronto, but a ban and quotas restricting Japanese Canadian settlement here drove them further east. In 1988, the federal government apologized and provided redress for their unjust actions. I, along with my parents, were in the House of Commons that day. And the hope was that these actions, along with the creation of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, would ensure a place in the history books for our story and guard against similar injustices. Nonetheless, 2 years later, prominent white historians published a book which outrageously suggests that the treatment of Japanese Canadians was a form of mutual hostage keeping. At a 1998 speech at the Empire Club, one of these historians lamented that present-day Canadians, if they ever knew there had been a Second World War, probably remembered only that this country had been unkind in the way it treated Japanese Canadians. How could this have happened? Who killed Canadian history? So for our history to be described as unkind treatment is an example of systemic racism in academia. And it reminds us of a BC politician, A.W. Neal, who said in the 40s, "This is a white man's country and we want it left a white man's country." Is Canadian history a white man's history? Acts of denial and selective amnesia contribute to new waves of anti-Asian racism. Our community hoped for never again, but we find ourselves thinking now, not again. Structural deficiencies and individual ambition continue to marginalize our scholars and community organizations in more subtle and covert ways. Community members must reflect on how we can work together to ensure deeply engaged community-led research is the norm. so that richer, more accurate, and meaningful histories result. Academics, whether insiders or outsiders, must understand the importance of their location in the communities they engage with. Relationship, humility, trust, and a deep understanding of racism matter. We must ask hard questions about who are the main beneficiaries of research projects. Does an academic agenda align with the real needs of racialized communities? Are the contributions of community storytellers properly acknowledged? Concerted efforts to mentor young researchers must take place, especially for communities whose elders had their education disrupted by racism. The Ours to Tell project looks to Indigenous research methodologies to understand the challenges faced by racialized scholars. While we recognize our settler experience is distinct, the work of Dr. Margaret Kovach deeply resonates. We are so grateful to have her here with us today. We look with humility and respect to the wisdom of Indigenous communities, wisdom distilled from the pain of inhumanity endured. We're inspired by the words of Phil Fontaine, former National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who said, "The attempt to transform us failed. The true legacy of the survivor then will be the transformation of Canada." Well, contrary to the agenda you may have received, I won't reappear, and my closing remarks will be replaced by a 2-minute video with credits. A second Ours to Tell event takes place on Wednesday, April 20th at 8 p.m., and it's titled A Tribute to Kenadachi by Roy Ito. We will then launch the Japanese Canadian Researchers Directory, a fully functional bibliographic database, and provide access to a chapter from Roy Ito's Stories of My People, which is a tribute to Adachi, the author of The Enemy That Never Was. You can register online now at torontonajc.ca. Thank you to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and Sun Life for their seed funding for the Ours to Tell initiatives. We're so grateful to Dr. Tak Fujitani and the David Chu program at the Asian Institute for their role as presenting sponsor and immense contribution to the success of our projects. We will later present a gift to the department provided by one of our most dedicated visual artists, Lillian Michiko Blakey. So now on to our distinguished panel. Our moderator, Jennifer Matsunaga, is an associate professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Ottawa, unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Her interdisciplinary research examines reparations for historical injustices in settler states with a focus on Canada. Her reflections on truth-telling, shame, resilience, assimilation, colonization, and intergenerational trauma are rooted in her lived experience as a third-generation Sansei Japanese Canadian, and her family and community history of internment and redress motivates her. She's on the board of the Ottawa Japanese Community Association and NAJC Human Rights Committee, and is a founding member of the School of Social Work's Kinnis Tota Dimin Circle. Her academic writing has been published in Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education and Society, and Canadian Ethics Studies. Her creative writing and nonfiction work has been recognized in the CBC Books Nonfiction Prize competition. So thank you, everyone. And now, Jennifer Matsunaga.
Thank you, Lynn, for the introduction. I guess we'll take off my mask. Before I introduce our keynote speaker for today, I'll just give you a quick rundown of how we'll be spending our time together for the next few hours. We'll begin with a keynote address from Dr. Margaret Kovach, followed by a 50-minute panel discussion. We'll break for 10 minutes at 3:30 if my timekeeping works well, and some light refreshments will be available at that time for everyone. At 3:40, we'll reconvene for a second half of our panel discussion, followed by brief reflections and comments from Dr. Kirsten Emiko McAllister, who joins us today from Simon Fraser University. A 20-minute question period will follow where I'll take questions from our online viewers and from you in the audience here today. And that's it. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend the next 3 hours with us today. It's an honor and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Margaret Kovach. Dr. Kovach is of Nehio and Saulteaux ancestry from Treaty 4, Saskatchewan, and a member of Pasqua First Nation. She is an Associate Dean for Indigenous Education and a professor at the Department of Educational Studies in UBC. She's also a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada. And among her publications, Dr. Kovach is the author of the well-known text, Indigenous Methodologies, Characteristics, Conversations, and Contexts, published by University of Toronto Press, which is now in its 2nd edition as of last year. She's a co-editor of the newly published edited book, Royally Wronged, the Royal Society of Canada and Indigenous Peoples. Dr. Kovach is an internationally known scholar in Indigenous research methodologies with research interests that include Indigenous higher education and social justice approaches to education. Her research explores ways in which Canadian universities can cultivate environments that enhance the experience of Indigenous scholars and graduate students. As a post-secondary scholar, her teaching, research, and writing are compelled by a particular interest in how members of university communities might work, learn, and live at the intersectionality of diversity in the service of compassionate, socially just relations. Before I call her to the podium, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to read a few excerpts from her book, Indigenous Methodologies. She writes, traditional Indigenous systems of beliefs typically have no relevance whatsoever as knowledge sources. The increasingly common response is to equate Indigenous knowledge with a cultural exoticism, and thus relegate them to the periphery of real work of knowledge construction. Both responses lead to the marginalization of Indigenous methodologies. The Indigenous exotic response can have disastrous implications because it can lead to a totemic understanding and exploitation of the more visible aspects of Indigenous culture without due consideration of the knowledges upon which these traditions are based. Additionally, it is a form of fragmenting Indigenous culture and extracting aspects that serve a mainstream purpose. It can also lead to a dismissal or disbelief by Western academia that Indigenous knowledges have relevancy within the construction of knowledge. Conventional scholars have become formidable gatekeepers of this system by objectifying knowledge into criterion-defined models, paradigms, and truth. Yet within this academic research discourse, we are fortunate if we're able to engage in discussions of knowledge. What qualifies as knowledge? What is its source? And how does new knowledge emerge? Unraveling the influence of white privilege has revealed how alternative ways of knowing have become marginalized and how it is that Indigenous inquiry has been left off the buffet table of methodological options. Much of what dominant society perceives as legitimate knowledge is generated by a rather small, homogeneous group of people in former institutions of higher learning. I share these excerpts from Dr. Kovach's work to bridge our perspectives in conversation today, as it resonates very much with what Japanese Canadian academics have faced in their experiences and the knowledge that has been produced about our experience and history by conventional scholars, as she calls them. The marginalization of community knowledge, which maintains Western privilege, the gatekeepers of this system, white privilege, and the small homogeneous group of people that dominate formal institutions of higher learning are all issues Japanese Canadian scholars have been dealing with for decades. And so today, while respecting and maintaining the important differences between our histories, experiences, and cultures in settler colonialism, I encourage everyone today to think about bridges as they relate to shared experiences with assimilation, with white supremacy, and with gatekeeping in academia, as well as the strength, resilience, and vibrancy of the people that make up our communities. And with that, I would like to invite Dr. Kovach to the podium for her talk. Thank you.
Just going to do, that sounds good. Nitotum, sakueo, pism, esqueo, kitchkesum, tonze, bojo, and greetings. I am Nehio and Soto from Treaty 4 territories of Southern Saskatchewan. There are more than 630 First Nations in Canada, and the Nehio and Soto, known, the Nehio are Cree and the Soto Ojibwe are two First Nations groups. I've traveled here today from my current home in British Columbia, where I live and work upon the lands of the Musqueam peoples in the Coast Salish territories. As I find myself here today at the University of Toronto, I wish to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit River. Many great cities are founded upon Indigenous lands and are a home for Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And I hold my hands up to the Indigenous presence in this place and for the welcome to this territory. Many thanks to our many hosts, the Dr. Chu program of the Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, in partnership with the National Association of Japanese Canadians, for the opportunity today to dialogue on the ethics of research in Indigenous and Japanese Canadian communities. I very much appreciated the invitation today and the invitation to share ideas on Indigenous research and Indigenous methodologies, the latter being very near to my heart. In reflecting on the complexities and advances in Indigenous research ethics for this keynote, it occurred to me that my conceptualization of Indigenous research ethics is inclusive in nature. By inclusive, I mean it goes beyond the scope of the more checkbox approach to ethical protocols and is more about an ethos of Indigenous research. The ethos that I am thinking of is based upon traditional Indigenous values of respect, reciprocity, responsibility, kindness, and care for each other in this world. An Indigenous research ethos takes into account the beliefs, approaches to relationships, and necessary protocols important to Indigenous peoples. And as those protocols and beliefs and relationships are applied to research design, methodology, and methods. An Indigenous research ethos creates and requires space for Indigenous people to share their own stories from their own voice. An Indigenous research ethos asks that we pay attention to the forces that work to expand or conversely limit Indigenous voice in Indigenous research. So I want to address all of the above in my talk, and the TED Talk tips tells me that a talk should be structured into 3 main points. But Indigenous storytellers tell me from the storytellers in my own family and community that there's nothing wrong with the 3-point approach, but there's always time for one good story. So to start, a story that helped prepare me for this keynote today. It's a story that some of you may be familiar with already. It's a story about a boat. As I mentioned, I am from Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan, but I currently live in Vancouver. My spouse, Monty, however, moved to Vancouver Island in his childhood. And then he spent a lot of his early adulting years in Northwest BC. Like Neil Young's town in North Ontario, for Monty, Union Bay on Vancouver Island is the place he goes inside his mind, where there are good memories that bring comfort and connection. I have my own town in North Ontario, except it's in Saskatchewan. The big skies of the flatlands typically inspire my talks. But intuitively, I knew this wouldn't be the case this time. I knew my inspiration would come from the Pacific waters, not the prairie skies. I just didn't know how. And I might not know how to take it to the next slide. Which one do I? Oh, yeah, I was doing that. It didn't work. So back to story. As the story goes, a while back, Monty and I were at our home near UBC, and we decided to go out for a Sunday breakfast at Denny's on Southwest Marine Drive. Denny's is what I think of down the hill on Marine Drive from the university. And I like the drive because there's a point where the city vanishes and the trees, the sky, and the Salish Sea claim space before the city annexes consciousness again. Plus, it's a long enough drive, about 20 to 30 minutes, without traffic or depending on traffic, to think things out and to talk things through. So that morning on the drive, I was chatting to Monty about this conference. The purpose, I said, from my understanding, is to dialogue on Japanese, Canadian, and Indigenous research ethics, given our experience as researchers from the margins. Given the history of erasure and marginalization, I said to Monty, the thing I'm really struggling with is, where do I start? How do I keep the focus on Indigenous and Japanese Canadian experience without handing over all of the energy, all of the space, and all of the oxygen to a discourse on whiteness? As I was talking, I could see Monty thinking. His hand was on the steering wheel, one eye on the highway, the other on the giant cedars moving past us. And so I paused, which is not always easy for me, but I did. And I asked him, what's up? He says, and quote, yeah, Morris talks a lot about the Nisga'a connection with the Japanese community. And then there's Harry's boat, right? So a little bit of context. Morris and Monty are good friends and go back years. Morris is Morris Squires and Harry is Harry Nice Sr. They are both Nisga'a citizens and live in the Nass Valley. They are both Samagat, or hereditary chiefs, in the Nisga'a hereditary system. Before retiring, Harry Nice Sr. was a commercial fisherman, and Harry's boat that Monty mentioned to me that day is a wooden gill netter built by a Japanese Canadian boat builder. The boat, he said, Monty said, is in the National Museum. That was the extent I got from Monty that day, because the conversation pivoted into fishing with Morris stories and put an end to my keynote quandaries that Sunday morning. But I was intrigued. After our morning drive conversation, I was still thinking about Samagat Harry's boat and the Japanese Canadian boat builder. Who was the boat builder and what was the story? So I went to the trusty Google search engine to see what I could find out. I was looking for descriptive information about the history of the boat from a museum website. So pretty descriptive stuff. Instead, I started getting search results that were curious. And I quote, "Lessons of Nisga'a Girl," and Nisga'a Girl reinstalled in the Canadian Museum of History. And the Nisga'a Girl has a place in our history after all. A Terrace Standard newspaper article from 2013 gave me some context. I learned that the boat's name is the Nisga'a Girl and was built in 1967 by Jack Tasaka, a Japanese Canadian boat builder who lived in Port Edward. From the period of 1968 to 1990, Harry Nice Sr. owned the boat. As a fisherman, he fished the West Coast waters, and when he retired, the Nice family donated, and I quote, "the wooden gill netter to the Canadian Museum of Civilization in 1998 to represent the West Coast fishing industry," end quote. In an article for the National Association of Japanese Canadians, Ken Noma writes that Samagat Herring Nice Sr., and I quote, "spoke about the long and respectful history between the Nice and the Tasaka families that began with his grandfather, Eli Gosnell, and Judo Jack Tasaka. It was his grandfather who advised the Nisga'a not to purchase any Japanese Canadian fishing boats seized by the Canadian authorities because or during the internment," end quote. When the Nice family donated the Nisga'a Girl to the Canadian Museum of Civilization in 1998, the National Association of Japanese Canadians helped to fundraise the cost to transport the boat. And as I read, I was struck by the special relationship between the Japanese Canadian boat builder, Jack Tasaka, and the Nisga'a chief, Eli Gosnell. I was heartened by this partnership because the Indigenous and Japanese Canadians were seen as having a long-standing relationship, and they worked alongside each other. Plus, in this instance, they worked alongside the Canadian National Museum, an institution of dominant Canadian society, to recognize this special history between these two groups. Maybe I should have stopped reading there, but I kept reading and learned there was more to the story. And know the fuller story we must. It turns out that in early 2000s, after the Nisga'a Girl was donated to the museum announced its intention to redevelop the Museum of Civilization into the National Museum of History, with a schedule for opening in 2017. During the planning period in 2013, at some point, the museum announced that it would be donating the Nisga'a Girl to the North Pacific Cannery Historical Site in Port Edwards. Based on the newspaper articles I could find, the reason for removing the Nisga'a Girl was that the museum did not think that this historic vessel fit in Canada's new National Museum. And even though the boat symbolized the significant historical relationship between Indigenous peoples and Japanese Canadians in our society, it was proposed that it be removed. This proposed removal of this gill netter that symbolized this important history was, from my perspective, erasure in plain view. Once the word got out and amid public pushback, the museum was forced to do a rethink. Ken Noma documents a meeting that occurred in 2013, and I quote, "On Monday, July 8th, at the NAJC Winnipeg office, an agreement was reached between the Canadian Museum of Civilization, the Nice family, and the NAJC to return the gillnet boat Nishka Girl to the new Canadian Museum of History." This was reassuring, but I have trust issues. And I wanted to know if the Nishka Girl was still in the Canadian Museum of History. So just before this keynote last week, we reached out to the museum, and I learned that yes, the trusty gillnetter is still on display in the Canadian Museum of History. It is now located in a room called the Nishka Girl Salon beside the exit of the First People's Hall exhibition. Very cool, I say. I shared this story with you today because it fits. As Canadian researchers and citizens, we need to know the whole story of our history as told by many voices, not a single story curated by those who assume they know what is best, what is a fit, simply because they have the power to decide. The story of this boat carries many messages. A message of a steadfast and enduring relationship between our two communities and cultures. A message about how erasure can happen very quickly if we don't push back. And that change can occur when enough people come together. How does this link to my talk about Indigenous research ethics? It is a story that is about culture, about who gets space and who doesn't. And it is a story about the role of power in how an agency in how decisions are made. So on to my talk. I like using metaphors, and having chosen a metaphor to help give my 3-point talk some structure, it is not surprising that it's a boat. So for the remainder of my talk, I want to address these 3 points in context of an Indigenous research ethos. The bow represents Indigenous culture and community in Indigenous research through a spotlight on Indigenous methodologies. I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous methodologies because I love doing it. The port side and starboard represent structures of resourcing and governance necessary for sustaining an Indigenous research ethos. And the stern represents power. Indigenous research exists within mainstream institutions for the most part, and thus we must pay attention to the relations of power. So to start with the bow, or for culture and community, as a way to focus on the importance of cultural knowledge in Indigenous research, let's briefly delve into research design talk for a bit. To do this, I would like to talk about Indigenous methodologies. Indigenous methodologies is a research methodology based on Indigenous culture, community, epistemology, and theory, with the subsequent ethics, protocols, methods, and interpretations congruent with an Indigenous perspective. I'm not going to go deep into the ins and outs of Indigenous methodologies, except to say that it is founded on Indigenous cultural knowledges and directed by Indigenous communities. While Indigenous methodologies is a form of Indigenous research, the two terms, Indigenous research and Indigenous methodologies, are not interchangeable. So how do they differ, and why does it matter that we know the difference? Indigenous research is an inclusive term, and it casts a wide net. There are many different types of research methodologies that fall into the net of Indigenous research. The key point about Indigenous research, it is that research is research that is carried out by and with Indigenous people, and research that is relevant to Indigenous communities. Indigenous research, if done ethically and responsibly, tells the story of Indigenous people through the perspective of Indigenous peoples and communities. If not done respectfully, research done under the name of Indigenous research can lead to deficit theorizing of Indigenous peoples. For our purposes here, what is key to know is that Indigenous research and Indigenous methodologies are not interchangeable. So how's that so? Indigenous methodologies is a specific type of qualitative research methodology, a specific way of doing research. Methodologically speaking, for a research approach to be an Indigenous methodological approach, the methodology and methods must be informed by the Indigenous community and anchored in Indigenous thought, culture, theory, ethics, protocol, story, and interpretation. Indigenous methodology are based at the core on the cultural values, practices, and knowledges of Indigenous peoples. And the key message here is that there are many types of research with differing methodologies that can be considered Indigenous research, but not all are Indigenous methodologies. The methodology, of course, depends on the research being asked. And I argue there's a need for a diverse range of research approaches. That's important. However, Indigenous methodologies is of particular significance when we want to hold up Indigenous culture. And this is of a real important key point here, because it provides us the methodological tools in the way we do research to really acknowledge, hold up, and put first Indigenous culture in this approach. And that's why it's a significant part of an Indigenous research ethos. So what is, I think, really sort of an important piece of this, when we think of culture, we also have to think of community, right? Culture and community go hand in hand. And we understand that when we're doing research with Indigenous culture and Indigenous community, it takes time, it can be complicated, but it matters if we want to really uphold Indigenous voice. But I do want to focus on culture for a little bit. When we think about culture, we must think about both the tangible and intangible aspects of culture. Tangible material culture is in many ways easy to identify. We can touch, taste, and see material culture. The teepee as a material construct, a building, near the Foul Hills Tribal Council, lighting up the night sky is an example of tangible culture. For those of us from Treaty 4, this construct, this teepee, signifies home no matter where we are in the world. But it is not only the teepee itself, but the stories told by the teepee under the night sky, or the teachings of cross generations of how to tan a hide that are also culture, though intangible they may be. The UNESCO Convention for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage defines intangible cultural heritage, oral traditions and expressions, including Indigenous language as a vehicle of the intangible cultural heritage. Includes performing arts, social practices, rituals, festive events, and knowledges and practices concerning the nature and the universe. Indigenous methodologies recognize and uphold Indigenous culture and community practices. Indigenous methodologies create and maintain space for Indigenous culture to inform research. That is their power. Part of creating an Indigenous research ethos is having the methodological tools that recognize and involve Indigenous culture and community, because the existing methodological tools we have in Western society in universities today, at the University of Toronto, UBC, University of Saskatchewan, are based on Western paradigms. And so Indigenous methodologies allows us an opportunity to create space for Indigenous thought and Indigenous paradigms. However, it is not only culture that we need to think about in Indigenous research ethos. So let's turn port side. So Dr. Jennifer Matsunega, Japanese Canadian social work scholar, recently wrote an absolutely excellent article, Jennifer, it was so good, entitled Carefully Considered Words, the Influence of Government on Truth-Telling About Japanese Internment and Indian Residential Schools. The article explores historical justice, apology, and truth-telling experience in both the Japanese Canadian and Indigenous communities. In reflecting on both the Japanese Canadian Redress Agreement and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Dr. Matsunega succinctly articulates the criticality of reparations in the conclusion of her article, and she says, I quote, "Through analysis of the government's response to redress, I demonstrated that truth-telling, compensation, and apology are they're linked. I'm not intricately linked. I'm stumbling on the word. Long and short of it, they are linked. Can't have one without the other. While she is focusing on compensation within the broader context of historical injustice, the point is about restitution through resourcing. We cannot discuss ethics and equity in Indigenous research if we do not talk about resourcing and specifically research funding and how research is funded in this country. We must talk about also the governance and control of that funding. Questions we must ask include, how is Indigenous research being funded? Who is being funded? Who has control over those funds? Is the Indigenous community involved? We must follow the money if we are to decolonize Indigenous research, or decolonize research to create ethical Indigenous research. I note that this is not a simple task of transferring funds to the Indigenous community because there are real capacity issues. We're on the right track, but there are. And having been in an Indigenous leadership position in different instances, I know this to be the case. We're moving forward and we're moving in the right direction, but equity, resourcing, and capacity also go hand in hand. And so we must remember this intersectionality. So in establishing a strong Indigenous research ethos, we must pay attention to structures and systems that work to either impede or advance the decolonization of Indigenous research. So the STERN is also part of the whole situation that we have to think about, because that is symbolic for where power resides. In engaging with mainstream institutions, we as Indigenous people know we have to pay attention to power. Wherever white dominance prevails in institutional context, and that is the majority of Canadian institutions, we as marginalized people must be conscious of power relations and ever ready to push back. It is helpful oftentimes to have a framework to assist us in staying alert to the systemic and systematic patterns of behavior that sustain racism and injustice in Canadian institutions as universities. And there are a wealth of different frameworks available, but I actually find Nancy Fraser's theorization of how social injustice manifests to be useful. And so based on this theory, injustice manifests in economic disparity, cultural dominance, and the lack of political voice. And so Fraser's frameworks considers redistribution of wealth, recognition, cultural recognition, and representation. Redistribution of resources, process by which to counteract economic disparities. Recognition of marginalized populations is a process that works to counteract erasure, bias, and deficit theorizing. Representation attempts to remove obstacles for marginalized people to gain political power in decision-making. Konstantin Pedokov has applied Fraser's theory of recognition, redistribution, and representation to the Indian residential school settlement agreement. And I think we could also apply it to Indigenous research. For example, in the past decade, we've seen an increase in the redistribution of research resources which fund Indigenous research and capacity development designated toward Indigenous research. However, this redistribution of research resourcing has been complicated by the fact that funding systems and structures are not yet decolonized. This has led to funding being injected into Indigenous research, but not necessarily to Indigenous researchers or the Indigenous community. Recognition is happening. We see OCAP, Indigenous Ethic Watch Protocols, Chapter 9, for those of us involved in Indigenous research or in research in university. Chapter 9 is the chapter of the Tri-Council policy statement that talks about ethics. It's devoted specifically to Indigenous research. So there's ample publications by Indigenous authors that has enriched the literature available to us as Indigenous researchers: Archibald, Baptiste, Tuai Smith, Wilson, and the list goes on. So recognition is happening. However, as redistribution and recognition intersect, there still remains the matter of representation of power. And the politics of representation is about removing obstacles in the political sphere so marginalized groups have a seat at the decision-making tables. And as we move toward indigenizing universities and decolonizing academic institutions, for example, we're seeing advances in representation. However, there must be a critical mass in order to do this. And that means within our academic institutions, there needs to be a critical mass of Indigenous students, staff, faculty, and leaders. There's a capacity crunch, and we still have work to do in terms of the politics of representation. However, we must continue as representation requires presence. And I think it's my sense of redistribution and recognition. It is representation that may possibly lead us to the most turbulent of waters. So this brings me to my conclusion of my talk. In creating and sustaining an Indigenous research ethos founded upon Indigenous cultural values requires a systematic approach. We need to have a strong bow that leads with culture and community. We need to be mindful of the port side and starboard that gives us the necessary equity nourishing structures that will resource and provide space to govern. Finally, we must pay attention to the stern and the turbulent relations of power that can impede our ability to tell our own stories in our own way. My talk is focused on Indigenous research, but my hope is that it honors the story of different cultures holding each other up, about the value of culture and the importance of many voices for a socially just society. It's about the teepee that lights up the night sky and the wooden gill netter that asks us to remember who we are as Canadians. As a society, a just society is what we want to be working toward. For we only have to be in this world to turn on our TVs to know that humanity suffers and the heart aches when cultures are destroyed. We know that democracy thrives when equity thrives. So finally, I'm doing what I tell my students, don't do it, students, is I'm going to take a quote. I'm going to quote a quote from an article, and I'm quoting Jennifer's article. And the reason I'm doing it is because it's just so good and it just so fits. It's wise teachings from the West Coast through the amazing heart and mind of David Suzuki from many years back. And I quote David Suzuki, "I have a special responsibility, and that is not to forget how fragile democracies and guarantees are. And one of the things I have to do is to be very aware of other people who are being put down or oppressed for irrational things like their race or their sex or their religion. And so one has to then work together with other groups and try make this place a better place." Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm really looking forward to the dialogue this afternoon. Hi, miigwech and ekose.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kovach, for that moving and very important talk. We're all honored to hear those words, and thank you for so generously referring to my work. I'd like to invite our panelists to the panel up here at the front to start a discussion. I'll name and briefly introduce everybody from my left to the right. So coming up to the front will be Dr. Henry Yu, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at UBC and principal at St. John's Graduate College, also UBC. Beside him is Dr. Mona Oikawa, associate professor in the School of Gender and Sexuality and Women's Studies at York University. Beside her, it was Dr. Kovach, who will also be joining in our conversation today, of course. Beside Dr. Kovach is Dr. Pam Sugiman, who is professor and dean of the Faculty of Arts at X University, formerly known as Ryerson. And beside her is Todd Duncan, PhD candidate in social and political thought at York University. And last but certainly not least is Bailey Irene Midori Hoy, a research assistant here at the University of Toronto. So this is our panel for today. We have a series of themes that we're going to look at together today. I might lump a couple of them together in the interest of time. We'll have about half an hour or so to talk about one area, which I'll name in a second, before our break. We're going to move at quite a clip because we have quite a bit to cover today. So please forgive me in advance if I interrupt you to move on to the next theme. We hope these conversations will continue moving forward, and we see this just as a beginning. So our first theme for the day, and I'll say we'll break it at 3:30. So yeah, we have 25 minutes. So our first theme is knowledge production, but I'm also going to, so broadly, knowledge production. And the next theme was going to be about community, but I'm going to ask you to sort of reflect on both. As Dr. Kovach just mentioned, they are linked and can't be separated. So if you could reflect on why it is important to have Indigenous and Japanese Canadian perspectives, approaches, and knowledge production lead in academic research concerning our own communities. And maybe how or what are some of the impacts, challenges, and or dangers facing communities who have been subject to significant research attention? Or how might research change, affect, influence the self-understanding of communities and its individual members, either positively or negatively? And since Dr. Kovach, you're warmed up, would you like to lead? I should say this is a very free-flowing panel. We're going to be just in conversation, so anybody can jump in, but I was wondering if Dr. Kovach, you'd like to start.
Which one did you want me to?
It's up to you. If you want to talk about why it's important to have Indigenous perspectives lead in research, although you just did, or what are some, actually, since you just talked about knowledge production, if you could speak to some of the impacts, challenges, or dangers facing communities of who have been subject to significant research attention, if not led by.
Okay. Oh, no, sorry. It's hard to know. Yeah, well, one of the, when I think about sort of what are some of the jeopardy, the risks, right? I think, it's always you're having to balance the risks with ensuring that you're involved and that you have a stay. But one of the, sorry.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you. I just realized in my nerves, I forgot to introduce Dr. Laura Ishiguro, who is with us online. I'm so sorry, Laura. Laura is also here, who should be on the screen at some point. Okay, sorry, you can continue. I'm very sorry I interrupted you.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Yeah, and I don't want to say too much because I'm really interested in the other panelists sort of having a chance to share their ideas. But I think one of the real risks is that that if you want to involve community in a real way, it takes time. And, sort of even when you're doing a proposal, you need to ensure that there's the resource, the funds to be able to do that in a good way. And one of the key things that we run up against is that there are times when researchers will go out to communities and it's expected that communities, for example, voluntarily do a lot of work to support the research project. And, it's very extractive and it can be exploitive. So that's one of the challenges and the risks. But on the other hand, it's also balanced with wanting to make sure that there's a presence and engagement. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Feel free to jump in.
Sorry, I thought I would address the first question.
Sure.
Since I prepared something for it. I want to thank you so much for your generous words and your work. And I've learned so much from you. Thank you. Also, I want to thank the organizers of the symposium. I wanted to maybe talk a bit about academia because we're immersed in it, but sometimes to really convey the conditions of our work, I think are really important. So I'm not a quantitative researcher, but I'll start with some figures. For example, the 2016 census, there were only 1.4% of all faculty members in Canadian universities who were Indigenous, right? At York University, where I teach, it was 0.8% of all faculty in December 2020. Black faculty constituted 2% of all faculty members in Canada in 2016. And unfortunately, York doesn't disaggregate the data. In fact, they collapsed all people who are Black employed at York into one kind of grouping. So it's very skewed. In terms of people of Japanese ancestry, in the 2016 census, it was 0.6%. right? So this gives you an idea of the conditions of our work. I just want to read a quote from Sanera Tabani in her edited collection, Coloniality and Racial Injustice. She argues, quote, all universities are predicated on ongoing Indigenous dispossession, a process in which these institutions played and continue to play an active role, end quote. The university upholds colonialism, settler colonialism, and white supremacy by controlling how many Indigenous peoples, Black and racialized peoples work in the academy, and by supporting some projects that extract knowledge from Indigenous and Black peoples and racialized peoples, among other technologies of settler, racial, and heteropatriarchal power. And I just refer people, please, to look at, Sanera's book, but also The Equity Myth by Henry Dua, James Kobayashi, Lee, Ramos, and Smith. I just want to say, as a queer woman of Japanese ancestry, or Sansei, I'm differently positioned from Indigenous scholars whose territories I occupy, and differently positioned from Black scholars. I do not wish to conflate my experience as identical or even similar to their experiences or those of other racialized faculty. And in fact, in my work, I have also contested the homogenizing of all Japanese Canadians as the same, or all Sansei the same, all Nisei, which is a narrative that we hear time and time again. I've spent my career defending my research in the White Settler Academy and using my research and knowledge to change the curriculum and to inform my service to the university community. The numbers in terms of faculty compositions say a lot, I think, about why our research is needed, but also suggest how difficult it is to do our research as racialized faculty, especially without support.
Thank you, Dr. Oikawa.
Maybe I'll step. Thanks so much, Dr. Kovach and Dr. Oyakawa. And I know that we don't want to talk about whiteness, and I totally agree with that. But I think that question of what's the damage and why, I've heard the term extract and extractive several times. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about, in terms of the production of knowledge, why is that research often so extractive? There's a long history of how, I would say, research often is the expansion of the bounds of ignorance of a small set of people. You'd think it'd be the expansion of the bounds of knowledge, but actually it's based upon what does one set of people not know? And so there's often a pathology of these are problems. There's an Oriental problem. There's a Negro problem. There's these people are the problem. There's health issues. There's this, there's that. There tends to be, the way we name racism, it's anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, as if it's the victim that we name the problem for. And so that pathology of we discovered a problem. Now we've got to go research it. That's what I mean by the expanding the bounds of ignorance. And that tends to objectify the people being studied, tends to be extractive in the sense of, as long as we figure out a couple answers, then we can move on. So hit and run research, a kind of extractive, let's go look at this community for now, get a bunch of funding, write an article, bye-bye. There's no relationship building. So if you notice how opposite, Indigenous methodology, as Dr. Kovach has outlined it, it's the opposite in some sense of extractive hit and run research. It's the opposite of the doctrine of discovery, that I don't know something, I go discover it, write an article, become known as an expert, and then move on. Right? It's not a relationship building. The people there don't have to trust you. You just need to get what you need and go. It's like the resource industries of British Columbia. You clear cut the trees, you move on, you leave the mountainside cleared. So that kind of resource extraction model. And I'll tell you a story, I'll end with the story rather than beginning with it. I was at a conference and there was a researcher who was talking about what he had found. Right? And there was these amazing letters that were, from community members basically protesting the liquidation of, property, Japanese Canadian property. And the term that struck me was, I found this man's letters. I discovered this letter. Those letters weren't discovered by him. They had been carefully saved, gathered, curated by the Japanese Canadian community, both before and after the redress movement. That set of history, even though it may not have been talked about a lot, as Dr. Futatani opened up with, it may have been some silence and even erasure around those stories, but someone had saved that letter or that set of letters deliberately. So to say that the researcher has come and discovered something, I think that is, that attitude is what academic research is geared around. There's many different methodologies, but you could say that at heart, the damage is done by extractive hit and run research that valorizes not having a relationship. I'm an outsider. That's the best thing. I'm just going to come in. Therefore, I have no relationship to the object being studied. They're like spiders or potatoes or, plants. We don't have a relationship. I just study them, figure out the problem with them, say something, maybe say a solution and move on. And so hopefully that is perhaps a way to understand what I think Dr. Oyakawa is, in my mind, talking about the difficulty of working in that kind of environment where that's where the funding goes, is to answer questions out of ignorance, and who doesn't know it. So I think that's one of the ways I often think about the toil of being a racialized faculty member or a racialized researcher, is just having to first prove that you can handle research on a problem and that maybe you have a different way to approach it and you have to work with community and it's going to take longer and it's going to, all the things that Dr. Kovach said, that's not going to be rewarded.
Thank you, Henry. Yeah, Todd, yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, and I think responding to what Henry is saying, some of this sort of doctrine of discovery is even more explicitly stated than just someone saying, I found these documents. I think there are probably 4 authors in particular who have very explicitly referred to either that they, being white historians, that they have a level of objectivity or distance from the topic of Japanese Canadian history that allows them to work on this particular project more effectively than Japanese Canadians themselves. Or there are other white historians who say, in criticizing the work of Japanese Canadian authors, that the work is too emotional or it's too narrative. And in many respects, I think it connects with what you're saying, Henry, in that it sort of provides this like distance for white historians to have in addressing Japanese Canadian history. But what is particularly curious about that for me is the fact that in doing that, it sort of removes them from that history of racism, as in removes white historians from that history of racism as though they have no connection to it, which is a very strange thing to say when we're talking about Japanese Canadian, the internment of Japanese Canadians, because that was not something that is only a Japanese Canadian history. That is a Canadian history. That is a white Canadian history. And for a white historian to say that they have objectivity in approaching that is really quite confounding.
Thanks, Todd. Bailey, yeah.
Yeah, just tying off that point. In the past few papers that I've had to write, particularly my first paper that's in press at the moment, I've had to explicitly write at the very beginning of it, yes, in case you're curious, I am Japanese Canadian. Yes, in case you're curious, I do know a lot of the people that are in this, and I'm not going to be totally unemotional and removed from this because this is what happened to me and my family. And I've definitely received lots of different reactions to writing that in. Some people approve of that, but some people think that's not traditional history and that I'm far too emotionally connected. And that's exactly what you were talking about, Todd. And I really want to reinforce as well my belief that I think that our community is at a crucial moment right now when it comes to research and knowledge and sharing between the generations. We're in a time where our Yonsei have really come into their own and become interested in this history that they've carried on through the generations and that they've wanted to know. And they've pushed and they've looked for this information. And in some cases, they've had to dig through archives with their bare hands and try to find just any scraps they can find anywhere. And in doing so, in many cases that I've personally talked about conducting oral history, they've also been able to involve their parents, the sansei, in this work as well. And in some cases as well, their grandparents, the nisei. And we're at a moment right now where that passing of the baton of knowledge and the publication of that knowledge is beginning. And we need to think really critically as it passes to the next generation of what legacy we want to leave them and what sort of academic, of what opinions in the academic community is an acceptable way of writing history and where our community should stand in that as the next generation begins to learn and, like I said before, come into their own.
Thanks for bringing that intergenerational aspect to this, Bailey. Pam, Dr. Sugiman.
Thank you, Dr. Kovach, for that really moving and inspiring and informative talk. And thanks to everyone for your insights. I will follow your lead and start with a story, and it won't be a long one, though it could be. I'm like Mona, a third generation Japanese Canadian. And, I saw myself because of the history of our community as white as I was growing up. And it very well, over the years, it became impressed on me by others that, no, you're not white. You are, and there were all sorts of racist names hurled at me. I had lots of internal discussions, discussions in my own mind about my racial identity, my subjectivity. And it wasn't until I was a tenured professor that I started to do research on my own community and felt a closeness for the first time. And I do oral history interviews, listening to the members of my own community, people like my mother, people like my grandmother, my grandfather. So I remember very vividly the first time I went to British Columbia to do this research, to interview people like my mother and grandmother and father and grandfathers. It was such an emotional journey for me. And my daughter was very young at the time, and she accompanied me. And, she was, I think she was 7 for the first trip, maybe 10 the next trip. And she wrote stories about her bachan, her ancestors. And so it meant so much to me, to my family. So it wasn't just my journey as an academic, it was my personal journey as well. It was about finding out more about my community, my family members. I went and visited the street where my father and his family used to live. I went to see where he was picked up as a prisoner of war because he in Vancouver, because he refused to go off with the RCMP and leave his hometown. So I later became a part of a project led by non-Japanese Canadians, largely by white men. And their approach was so entirely different and devoid of any, excuse me, I think I'm becoming emotional, and that's why my voice is breaking, devoid of any emotion. And this is, and I don't want to take too much space and time, but this is why I firmly believe that it is important, if you are not a Japanese Canadian doing research on Japanese Canadians, You form relationships with the people in the community. You have a sensitivity, you understand the cultural context, you understand what it means, this history, uncovering history means to the people who have lived through it and who's thinking about intergenerational transmission of memory and whose children and their children are similarly living through that history and working their way through it.
Thank you, Pam. I just want to ask, I'm going to call on you, Laura. Again, I'm sorry about missing you. I didn't see you on the screen and I wasn't prompted. So would you like to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Am I a floating head here? I'm just curious. Yeah, you're all looking up at me. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm trying to picture the room here. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you for these really significant contributions, and thank you, Dr. Kovach, too. So I'm speaking to you today from from my home, where I live and work and occupy Musqueam territory. And I'm Yonsei, but I also am Yonsei via a slightly different trajectory. The Ishigeros were in Kauai. I'm the first generation born in Canada, and that will become relevant to the things that I have to say. And Jen, I am attentive to time, so don't worry. So I work in a history department, and it was with some lack of surprise and some alarm that I realized that I am maybe one of the first, if not the first, person of Japanese descent in a tenured position in Canada who's trying to make a go of work in this field in a history department. It does not escape my attention that the people whose work I look up to so much, including those on this panel, have found disciplinary homes outside of history, even as they've engaged with the past of Japanese Canadian people. And so I think a lot of the conversation so far has had to do with this particular disciplinary culture within history, although this is also very much about the academy more broadly, as Dr. Oikawa has pointed to as well. And so I just want to say a couple of things. So in my training as a Canadian historian, I was under the impression that there were not Japanese Canadians writing histories, academic histories of the community. I knew of Mona's work, I knew of Pam's work, I knew of Kirsten's work, and I knew it was very much outside of the discipline. And what I found in the discipline was an intense hostility, this will come as no surprise to them, to the particular perspectives, questions, focus, and methodology of their work. And I was desperate for the work that they've been doing. And it took me so long to realize that the questions I was struggling to ask had already been asked, and how much it hurts to realize that for more than my lifetime, Japanese Canadian people have been saying those things and asking those questions in these incredibly difficult, vibrant, ongoing conversations within and beyond the community. And those have not registered within the disciplinary practice that I am trying to survive in. And what I found instead, and Todd has gestured to this as well, in many responses, there's a long-standing pattern over more than 4 decades of responses to Japanese Canadian work that has been hostile to questions that have centered the anger, the pain, but also the creativity and relations and questions among Japanese Canadian people, and in relation, for example, with Indigenous people and other communities. But instead, many practicing historians have critiqued that for anger, for bitterness, for personal relations that they've framed as not well positioned to analyze the history. And it is extremely clear that the questions they are seeking are questions that are actually about using Japanese Canadian history to understand white racism and the state. And the ultimate questions that many of them have been seeking, and the questions about Japanese Canadian history as it's practiced in the academic discipline, is really about trying to understand white people. And there's so much hostility to questions that ask us to go beyond that. And I think about Rita Wong's work in decolonization, where she asks, what if we articulate who we are not in relation to a kind of normalized whiteness, but in relation to our responsibilities and relations to Indigenous people, to the land that we're on. And I think I said I was attentive to time, Jen, and I that I've spiraled. I'm getting there, I promise. So I just want to quickly say a couple of things about the harm that I think this does, or what it forecloses for us. So one is, I think that what happens with this focus on white racism, and particularly in relation to Japanese Canadian internment, is the history of internment has got held up as a kind of model injustice. And I'm playing on this as a kind of model minority thing, but within the broader Canadian histories that get told, what happened to Japanese Canadians is held up as particularly bad. And there are tropes that get played on here that I think are really important, really powerful, but they do harm in our relations and responsibilities to Indigenous people, to Black people, to other people who are experiencing marginalization and discrimination. And if never again is a rallying cry, I think we need to be really attentive to the histories that we tell ourselves that put us in relation and responsibility to other people, not just understand ourselves as a kind of model victim. And, you know, that's a kind of damage-centered research to draw from Eve Tuck's research as well, that situates us as damaged, as objects or subjects of study, not as experts with capacity in our own right. And I think the other thing for me that this does is it creates a very narrow narrative about what counts as Japanese Canadian history and why that matters. And that I have a lot of things to say about what that does in the practice of history more broadly, but I think one of the things it does within the community or the communities that we occupy is it actually creates a really, really narrow definition of who the Japanese Canadian community is and who counts as Japanese Canadian. And just to close, I'll say that as somebody whose family was not in Canada, was not interned during the war, although whose family was in Hawaii and very much experienced a particular history of the war there, I never thought I got to be Japanese Canadian. I always had a kind of asterisk on who I was. And I didn't think that I got to say anything about the history of Nikkei people in this place, even the kinds of histories that I see myself in and I relate to, and are histories of my family and my story here. And when I've started articulating that, I've realized how many other people say that too, not because of they have my story, but because in other ways they feel excluded from what it, or they feel questions, they feel nervous that maybe they don't quite count. And I think that when the history gets told for Japanese Canadians in a more narrow sort of way, we foreclose the possibility of telling these really diverse stories. And I want our community and communities to be strong enough to have different histories, to encompass and tell different histories, to be diverse and to ask ourselves hard questions. And for me, that is part of the story of telling our own histories. All right, Jen, sorry, that was a monologue. Thank you.
No, that was really great. Thank you so much. Thank you. We're at break time now. So thank you everyone for really providing very dynamic responses to all of this. Yeah, I won't take up more time, but we are going to go for break. We'll reconvene at 3:45 to give everybody a bit of time, and then we'll come back and continue with this. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Okay, so that was more than a 10-minute break. We're kind of all back in the room now, and I hope everyone is refreshed. We're going to dive right in here. for the second half of the conversation. Reflecting on Dr. Kovach, and if you can speak to some of this, is how the principles and protocols were developed. I know that there have been some in the Tri-Council context, but maybe there are other examples of principles and protocols or guidelines that direct us in terms of doing Indigenous research or using Indigenous methodologies. And I know that one of the things that the Japanese Canadian community is interested in is some kind of guidelines or principles to follow as well with research in the community. And so I was just wondering if you could speak a bit to either the development of this or their importance.
I want to take off my mask, but I'm not going to. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jennifer. I could just speak to it very, very briefly, but I would say when we really started thinking about protocols around Indigenous research, that really came out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which was when was that, Monty? When did the Royal Commission come out? It was in the 90s. 1996, thanks. Yeah, and during the commission, there was a number of different protocols associated with that was created by Indigenous people on the commission, and those protocols really, I would say, were around how do you do research in a good way? How do you do research in a way that it, sort of going back to like being the word extractive, not being extractive, and to ensuring that you have consent from the community, and that you were just doing research in a respectful, relational way. And that meant reaching out. And based on the Royal Commission, the RCAP protocols that at that time, then you saw a number of different conversations about Indigenous ethics in Canada. One was around what the Mi'kmaq people did with the Mi'kmaq Ethics Watch, and that was in Nova Scotia, and it was around research being conducted by or I don't know if it necessarily had to be research conducted by Mi'kmaq researchers, but definitely research that involved Mi'kmaq peoples and communities. And so researchers had to, and still do have to, go through basically a vetting process. Also at the time, the Canadian Institute of Health Research came up with research protocols, and that was developed by Indigenous people, and it was sort of through the process of CIHR, but those protocols again were kind of the foundation protocols that we talk about when we think about that when we talk about Chapter 9. So there's been a lot of work that has occurred on kind of a more formal basis, where there has been actual specific protocols, and you can go and do a, sort of the old Google search, right, and find out what are some of the specific protocols associated. But then there's also been what I call the more kind of informal protocols. And that is, what is your relationship with community? Are you doing research that the community wants? Are you doing research that involves the community without exploiting the community or stressing the community? Are you doing research where you're giving back to the community? Like, is it done in a relational way? And, sort of, Henry, I think you really sort of talked about the importance of, it's not, relationship not as a commodity, but relationship or research as relationship. And that's kind of the what does that mean in different communities? What does I think that means to me that you have to know the community you're doing research with, right? And so a lot of these projects that are kind of national projects are really big projects. It makes it challenging because I do think that you do have to be anchored in community. You have to have an understanding of who they are, what their expectations are, what their sense of protocols are, because it may differ from different Indigenous communities. Say Indigenous Musqueam might be different than Nahil communities, that may be different than, Ojibwe communities. So you have to really know, and you have to take time to form that relationship. And then the protocols kind of arise from that. But there are general overall principles, right? Which is just being respectful, relationship, or the research should be relevant, should be a responsible researcher. So I'll just kind of leave it out there, and maybe other folks want to jump in.
I don't know. Okay, hi. That idea of relationship first, I think, is really important, and the formal and informal protocols is so important. I think probably our panelists will talk about or find that a lot of the times the relationships are not built first. They're built after the fact or after the project has been determined by the researchers. And then as an add-on or a second thought, like, oh, I better get people from the community on board with this. So yeah, would anyone like to jump in? Bailey.
Just quickly on this, something that I've really noticed while observing and listening to all my different professors and peers who have talked about their research over the past year or so is I've really realized the importance of not only consent when conducting research within communities, but informed consent. There's a very big difference between going to a community and saying, oh, I'm going to do this research, I'm going to do this research, will you sign off on it? And telling them explicitly, I'm going to do this research. This is what it pertains. This is what it entails. Will you form a relationship with me to help us? Because without this informed consent and without a greater knowledge of that within the community, there might be parts of the community that splinter off from this and explicitly have different perceptions onto what the same project might be. And in doing so, not only does it create very skewed and potentially white-centric research products, but also it can further divide and cause harm to the communities that are being researched and ostensibly you're trying to give a voice to.
Thank you for that. I'm Mona. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Oh, yeah, if you get really close to
okay.
it.
Sorry, I in my chair. I think this is connected, but it also connects to what Laura was saying earlier. So I kind of wanted to give my own story. I've written a book, Cartographies of Violence, and in that book, I raised these kind of methodological questions, including quote, why are you writing about Japanese Canadians? And I was directing that not only at non-Japanese Canadians, but also, everybody who writes about Japanese Canadians. And then I said, do you consider the effects of your representation on Japanese Canadians? End quote. And I think self-reflexive questions about our relationship to the communities or peoples about whom and with whom we do research should be foundational to an ethical research practice. But I'll say really quickly that the response to my first question that I raised in my book by some white academics for me have been really informative. I mean, I was upset at the time, but for example, the white historian whose book, and I'll name it, it's the book that you mentioned in your introduction. I critiqued it in my book, and one of the authors of that book was invited by a Canadian journal to review the book. I mean, when I talk about gatekeeping, this is really what's happening, right, in terms of our work. And also they agreed to write it, even though they knew that I had critiqued the book. And not surprisingly, it was a negative review. Actually, it was a student, a PhD in history, who had read it and then emailed me. And actually, he in his email, he said, if this is emblematic of the discipline, I'm gonna quit. And of course, as someone who had taught him I said, we actually need you because of your critical approach to history, as Laura was describing to us quite a lack of in the discipline. And what I do want to, this is what's helped me survive in academia. I want to also recognize that it was an Indigenous scholar who had read my book and the review who supported me at that time and who wrote a letter to the editorial board of the journal questioning their process. And I'll name that colleague. It's Professor Benita Lawrence, who I have worked with and actually co-founded a degree at York with. And from that degree, we now have an Indigenous Studies program at York. And for me, this kind of collaboration in the academy and solidarity and support has really meant a lot to me because, as I said, it's very difficult to deal with these things on your own. And I'm just going to quickly quote Sanera Tabani again from this book that I'm reading right now. And she's referring to her own kind of history making critiques about the academy, about Canadian state, et cetera. And she says here, quote, to make these statements as a woman of color is to be visited by the full wrath of the institution for these truisms. And she's just talking about, like, we know this, right? We know this on this panel. For these truisms are met with outrage or sometimes fervent protestations of good intent by those empowered by the institution. Past experience has shown that such protestations soon turn to rage at what is then construed as the vengeful origin of the critique. So if we dare, as Laura said, to actually challenge, some of the kinds of tenets of the discipline itself, then we become the target and we have to be kind of contained or, gotten rid of somehow. And it can and it does affect publications, dissemination, and also getting grants, because some of these people who are kind of acquiring expertise on us then become the gatekeepers of our work, right? And the review for me was kind of emblematic of this process, right? So.
Thanks, Mona. I'm going to call Laura so that if you have something to say. I don't want to, I have a heart, from my vantage point, it was difficult to see you, so I can see you now.
It's totally fine, and I'm happy to go whenever. So I just want to build on a couple of things here. So my initial question, which I'm just going to raise and not answer, and I think it's a really hard one, actually, in the context of Japanese Canadian related scholarship, although it's one that builds on and from Dr. Kovach's comments. But I think there's a really difficult question about who is the community. And if we are talking about responsibilities, ethical relations, and the ways in which this plays out, I think there are difficult questions to ask about who gets, who is in partnership, who is in collaboration, who is spoken to. And I don't have answers to that, so I'm just going to raise it and then leave it. The other thing that I'm going to say is really building on, I think, both Bailey and Mona's points here. And Bailey made me think about consent, right? And I'm going to be, I'm going to talk about consent in a feminist way, right? So if we think about what consent is informed, but it is also free, it is prior, it is enthusiastic, and it is ongoing. And that applies to ethical research and consent and relations in the work that we do here as researchers researched and straddling the line between them. And so I think when we think about consent in that way, we also have to ask what happens when someone says no. Does the research get done anyway without them? Or does that relationship actually change the work or stop the work, right? And so what does a no mean, as well as what does a yes and from whom? And I also think that obviously this is all about power too. And I was thinking about this in Dr. Kovach's keynote as well, in thinking about the ways that representation in the kind of governance and administration of projects within the academy, representation is often a box ticking exercise. And it is not yet, we don't yet have structures, and I don't know what structures look like to help make it more than that. But I think there's a really difficult question to ask about power relations, but to whether representation or collaboration in a project is where the power is, and whether it is about being present in relation to a project, or who has the ability to shape the ideas, to shape the work, to shape the questions from the beginning and in an ongoing way. And if the ultimate answer to that is just one researcher who is working with community, but community doesn't actually have power to shape the work, then that's extractive, that's exploitative. And so I can see Henry making a move to talk here, so I will mute myself on that note.
Thank
Oh,
you,
actually, I
Laura.
wanted you to keep going, Laura, because just to pick up on something that Laura has brought up and Margaret and Mona, like when people say relationship, I remember once when I was a long conversation and we were talking about reciprocal relationships. And someone said, oh yeah, reciprocal relationship. It means that I get something and you get something. And I kind of went, no, that's not a reciprocal relationship. That's transactional. So, hey, if I give you X $10,000 and then we get this, and then it's a deal, it's done. That's actually often the mistake of when a relationship doesn't mean you get something, I get something. It's like birthday presents, right? That's a reciprocal relationship. I have my birthday, you give me something, and I go, oh, thank you. This is so thoughtful. And then, your birthday comes along, and I give you something I bought at Shoppers Drug Mart or something like that, right? Off at the cash. And you kind of go, oh, thanks. And then my birthday comes around, and guess what? You don't give me something, and I go, oh, I think I screwed up. And maybe I go, okay, I guess we have no relationship. But the next time, I may go, I think I understand now. I screwed up. So I go way over the top and I get you the thing you've always wanted your whole life, right? And then you go, okay, we got a relationship again. Relationships are through time. They can end. And to go to the when can you say no? At any point, I can not give you a birthday present or give you something crappy. And that's a signal. And that's how relationships are. So often, and I think I've had to unlearn much in working with, again, Musqueam and other Indigenous communities. It's like, no, we want a relationship with you. We don't want a deal, right? We don't want to make a deal and then that's it, we're done. It's like, and research, it fits into that context. If we have a relationship, then we're checking with each other iteratively. And at any given moment, there can be a no. Look, you guys have changed. You gave me a crappy present from Shoppers Drug Mart. We're over. But you have a chance to make up for it if you understand what you did wrong. And I think that's the other generosity sometimes of thinking of relationships through time. Maybe not. Maybe that was end of relationship. You really screwed up. But if there's a reciprocality, it's not transactional. I can't emphasize that too much in terms of ethics, is one for one, quid pro quo. These are not relationships. These are contracts, they're transactions, they're moments. And so that's the other thing I think about community relations is if there's a transaction made with one set of people, that doesn't mean you have a relationship with a community. In fact, communities are messy. People disagree. There's lots of different sets of people and things can change. It's one set of people that you thought you had an agreement with and you had a good relationship with. Tough luck. There's other people within that community who don't like them. And you'll have to deal with that in your research. So the disaggregation of this idea that there are monolithic communities, that's just the way communities are. and any expectation you can make one deal and then you're done. And that's a pretty colonial attitude.
Hmm. Thanks, Henry. Pam, I saw you leaning towards your microphone. Were you going to jump in or?
I do, I think, have some time to offer some final thoughts. So I.
Okay.
I will just sort of follow up with Henry on this. Margaret and I were talking about this earlier with regards to redress and maybe even reconciliation, without obviously conflating the two, because they're obviously very different. But there is something of a relationship of reciprocity there. In fact, you might say that it is entirely a relationship of reciprocity. And I think one of the challenges with I guess academic research for Japanese Canadians in particular is that I think the way white historians often approach the topic is in a way where their distance allows them to sort of not understand that relationship. And I think that that's vitally important, that there is a continuity of redress that needs to sort of be applied to this relationship that, white historians might have with the Japanese Canadian communities that are out there when they're doing research. And I think that that is often missing. What I think you see so often with sort of the analysis of redress is that it's done. It's a transaction. The transaction is complete. We move on from it. And that is sort of a very worrying state to be in. But again, I think for Japanese Canadian communities moving forward, and when we're talking about what research might look like moving forward, is that I would like to see more of that relationship of reciprocity existing within it.
Well,
Pam?
maybe I will.
Yeah.
I will add to the discussion. So the project that I think is in the back of our minds is the Landscapes of Injustice project that received funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council as part of a partnership grant the program, partnership grant program. And that's the one that I was very involved in. And I led the messiest, probably, well, at least in my view, the messiest part of the project, the one that involved the oral history cluster, which involved people going out and talking to people, the people who had experienced internment, or later on the people who were bystanders of to intern, or acts of racism generally. And so I've had an opportunity, I ultimately left that project, but I did have an opportunity to see what could have been relationship building and what some may view as relationship building. But what and this is my personal assessment only, viewed as a transactional exchange. And, so there were discussions about whether or not the National Association of Japanese Canadians should be invited to be one of the community members, and perhaps not because they held strong political views, whether or not racism should be discussed as part of the project, perhaps not. We just want to account for, for example, property loss. And that, in my view, is not relationship building. That is bringing people on and checking off the boxes. And when they weren't working out, bringing more people on, because, you need to show that you have a strong relationship with the community or community partners. So, I mean, this is my view only, and my experience. But so that is why I think if I were to, be asked by Shirk to provide my perspective and perhaps offer some advice on how you work with the community, I would say that you need to ensure that relationship building takes place. And as I think Henry said, relationship building with people within the community, including academics who form part of that community. That takes place prior to the conceptualization of a project.
Mona? Yep, Mona.
It's so wonderful to be with all of you and engaged in this conversation. But I just wanted to quickly say that my concern about research done on our community or communities, they're plural, is that we become divided from each other. And as I describe it, I talk about kind of our relationships being mediated through whiteness. You know, in my work, I've really tried to look, and I do this in my teaching too, at how we're positioned kind of in relation to each other, but also against each other. And it's been very disturbing to me to hear people I highly respect and that I'm meeting for the first time through this process. I'm really happy to do that, but I think the harm that this does to relations among us, the effects on the elders who are invested in sharing their knowledge and wanting so much to tell their stories, and also the effects on the young scholars and activists that I'm meeting in particular, who might be treated poorly through the exploitation of the labor, of their sharing of knowledge. And I'm talking about the elders in our community, and also doing the work to procure information for the researcher. I'm very concerned also that young scholars will be targeted for, you know, leaving projects or critiquing them. And I'm very concerned, and I'm really happy that we're organizing, because we need to support them so that they do not stop their research and give it up. You know, in my book, I interviewed people of, you know, the Sansei generation who weren't interned, but they tried to do projects. Like one woman wanted to look at the sociological and psychological effects of the internment. And they had no support. Like I'm talking about in the 80s or 90s. And in fact, one student at university in British Columbia tried to use Adachi and Sanahara, you know, and they were told, no, you cannot use those texts. And this is still happening, because I recently taught a student who came to me and said, okay, I want to do a project on the internment. And, you know, they were advised not to use Sanahara and not to use Adachi, but to use mutual hostages. And this was in the history department. So I said I'd be quick, but, you know, so I just wanted to voice my concern, but also my support, because organizing is really important.
Thanks, Mona. I'm actually going to take that opportunity to call. We have Dr. Kirsten Emiko McAllister online, and I think that might be a great moment to bring her into the fold here for some reflection and comment. Hopefully she will pop up on our screen on this end here. There she is.
Greetings.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. What a marvelous, rich discussion. I wanted to start off by thanking Jennifer, you, Takeshi, and Lynn for organizing this event, and all the sponsors and all the panelists. I grew up on the territories of the Nunavut people with my two brothers. I am now living and working on the territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations. And I'm thankful for the life, the air, the ocean, and the inspiration these nations have provided me with, as well as the strong sense of responsibility that I'm reminded about every day. in my life here, living as an uninvited resident on their territories. So Dr. Kovach, thank you so much for accepting the invitation to be the keynote, for your tremendous contribution in terms of Indigenous methodologies that informed and made the possibilities of our own research possible. So I want to thank you. I also want to thank you for the metaphor of the boat and its design as a way to speak to the relationship between Japanese Canadians and Indigenous nations. This is very powerful, both as a metaphor, but also as a way of thinking relationally. So you talked about the stern being involving power. You talked about the bow as about community and culture. Port side and starboard about the capacities and resources needed for communities to support the ethos of Indigenous knowledge and research. So before I turn to this really powerful metaphor, I wanted to just really briefly turn to my colleagues and friends on this panel and start with just an acknowledgement of the way in which all of you have shared some very difficult and troubling stories about the research that you've been committed to doing and the power relations you've been committed to challenging, and also the creative methodological work you've been doing that has also so inspired me, and being in a dialogue with you has just been enlivening. So I want to thank you for that. Pam, you talked about the importance of intergenerational relations in knowledge, and how knowledge, and this speaks very much to what Dr. Kovach was talking about, in terms of how the relations of knowledge produce us, constitute us. Mona, I was really struck, as I'm always struck, by your sense of responsibility of what's entailed when we do research and this knowledge, and about the complexities of navigating the power relationships at university, in the community, and beyond. Todd, your recognition of power and the gatekeepers and the authority about who controls knowledge about Japanese Canadians. So who has authority over who we are, what we are, and what are issues? That's been going on for the last 100 years. So we know that relationship very, very well, starting with government reports that have been supported by white historians and non-Japanese Canadians who've really taken advantage of what Henry talked about in terms of constructing us as the Japanese problem. Laura, you spoke also about gatekeeping, and while I want to acknowledge what Dr. Kovach said about not focusing completely on whiteness and that sucking the oxygen out of the room, I do want to return back to that, because I think that's part of the struggle we're involved in right now as Japanese Canadian researchers. But I also really want to point to what you emphasized in terms of the importance of multiple stories, and stories about and experiences that are basically marginalized within the community. There's no language, there's no narrative, there's no recognition of that richness. And so the growth and potential and the importance of supporting that research and those voices and that creativity. Bailey, you talked about crisis, and I want to talk about that when I finish what I'm saying. And you and Pam also talked about, I thought it was very striking the way you said that in the with non-Japanese Canadians who are researching community, there's this need for objectivity and this sense of being devoid of emotion, and emotion being inappropriate. Then on the other hand, as Laura pointed out and Mona pointed out, what's tied to this sort of repressed objectivity is hostility. Because as many of you have pointed out, if we question those researchers, if we refuse to engage with them and give them what they want, if we challenge them, there is aggression, there is anger, there is righteousness. So there's something there which I think needs to be further examined, because that is quite terrifying. Here, I want to turn back to the metaphor of the boat and the stern and questions of power. And Mona, you just talked about this quite extensively, but I want to turn also to the way in which power is replicated in our community. And I'll call it the establishment of our community, which includes academics, but also community organizations. I think there can be a tendency for us to reify community as this sort of immediately democratic, power-free space. And with SSHRC and universities prioritizing community-based research, we forget to look at sometimes our own responsibilities in the Japanese Canadian community about how we reproduce those power relationships. There's been years in the community since redress where white and non-Japanese Canadian scholars have been supported by community organizations over and above Japanese Canadian scholars who are asking difficult questions, trying out new methodologies. So I think we really need to look at power in the community and how all of us in different ways replicate it and act as gatekeepers. And here, I also want to turn to Dr. Kovach's discussion of the stern, where we also have to think about the resources and the capacities needed in the community to support an ethos of what she referred to as Indigenous knowledge. But I guess we can think about it in terms of Japanese Canadian, Japanese transnational knowledge. What resources and capacity do we need to build in our community? So not just blame community organizations, but as academics and others, as Jennifer is very much doing here, is turning to resources and capacity building. But the question here goes back to the bow. What are our epistemologies? What are our stories? What are our protocols? What are our traditions? Without research and hard questions, I don't think there's any clarity over what those might entail. The diversity that Laura's talked about, the rich knowledge that both Pam and Mona have generated through interviews. We have to face the way in which, while we don't want to fixate on internment as the complete definition of who we are, I think we have to face racial elimination and the government's plan to remove us and the very idea of what is Japanese Canadian. Because we need to think about what Bailey posed. Why is it that many members of her generation don't know about the rich, productive research from the 60s, the 1970s, and the 1980s in the community? Why is this research not known by that generation? That still, the research in that and the creativity and the artistic production in those periods still inspire me, confound me, propel me forward to explore more. And here, I guess, again, it turns back to what Mona was talking about, our responsibilities. And facing what Bailey, I think you talked about as a really important point in our community right now, around both crisis, change, and possibility. So we are facing a crisis. The fact that SSHRC has funded a non-Japanese Canadian and given that non-Japanese Canadian multi-millions of dollars to research us, to produce an authoritative voice over who we are, what our problems are, and basically gatekeep. So we're seeing what we saw in the early 1900s, the 1930s, the 1940s, 50s about power and knowledge. So I don't want to end there. I want to end with all the oral histories, all of the research, those protest letters, which Japanese Canadians have already written about. They weren't discovered. Many researchers already knew about those protest letters. Roy Meekie and others have drawn on them and used them, and they've inspired their political work. So I think there's much to learn. And yeah, that's my contribution. And again, I want to thank everyone for such a rich dialogue. And I want to thank Jennifer for all of your hard work making this possible.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for that very, very thoughtful reflection over this panel today. That was wonderful. Thank you. We are going to move into questions now. We are going to put up a microphone for the people that are here with us today. If you're going to ask a question and you're here, you have to speak into the microphone because otherwise the online viewers are not going to be able to hear the question. And while the microphone is getting set up, there are already questions coming in from online. And I'm going to start with this one. It's a comment and a question. Thank you, Dr. Kovach, for the wonderful keynote address, and to all the panelists for your wonderful interventions. One of the themes that has emerged is the issue of decentering. It was powerfully there in Dr. Ishiguro's comments and Dr. Kovach's keynote in the story of the Nishka girl and the Museum of History's inability to see the importance of the art and the gift because it involved two communities and not the government or the museum itself. My question therefore builds on this story and Dr. Ishiguro's initial comments to ask about the work that might be done around decentering, both within and beyond the Academy, and how the diversity of Indigenous and Japanese Canadian perspectives might help us to do this. What needs to be decentered and how? Thank you for your generosity and thank you for your participation today. So who would like to dive in with this one? Bailey.
Sure if my section will relate as much to the idea of the academia, that section of the institution, but I'd like to talk a little bit about my experience as an undergraduate student that wanted to study history that was not really considered a central or traditional part of Canadian history. So when I was quite young, when I was probably like about 7 or 8, I started talking about the internment in classes. And I was constantly told by people that nobody cares. It happened a long time ago. It happened to people that aren't part of my generation, and I'm only half, so I shouldn't talk about it anymore. Canada has changed. And I was told that again and again and again by teachers and students alike. When I went to university, it was the time when I started talking about the history again, because I realized that everyone would always tell the other kinds of history I was interested in. People would always study Civil War history and Tudor history, but no one was going to tell this history. And this was a story that needed desperately to be told, and it needed to be told right now. And I was again told, oh, so you'll be in East Asian studies, or, oh, so you'll study Japanese history. And whenever I told them I wanted to study Canadian history, I was always met with confusion because people always asked me, but this isn't Canadian history. Either they would tell me that explicitly or implicitly. And probably the most overt example of that I experienced at the university was when I applied to a Canadian history course that was about examining traditional history versus non-traditional history. I applied to the course despite not having the prerequisite, and I was told by the teacher after I told her about my research I'd done on Japanese Canadian work in my final year, she told me that I didn't know Canadian history enough and didn't have enough knowledge of Canadian history to take her course, and I would find it confusing. I have been very lucky, especially in the past year, to be accepted with open arms into a group of scholars that have supported my work and the questions that I ask and the stories that I want to be told. But so many people aren't lucky like that. I know so many Yonsei that were pushed out of studying history in their first and second years because they had no support. And I know so many Yonsei that exclusively use projects which might be found problematic and might be exploitative of our community because that's all that's available. We live in a generation that is trying to desperately recover from intergenerational trauma and pain. And to have that continue to be reused and constantly have us pushed out because we're not part of what is considered a central Canadian history is a crucial issue that I really believe needs to be fixed. And it's a very important conversation that needs to be had, and it needs to be had now. So
thank you, Bailey, for that really important intervention. That was brilliant. Anybody else want to comment?
Thank you, Bailey, for sharing that. And going back to something Mona also said about the most precarious people in this sort of discussion, in some sense, are younger students, returned students. It's more about their place in the academy. And, you know, the fact that they are the most targeted by gatekeeping, and you know, once they're not in, they're not in. And what you have to do to get inside the gate before you can, you know, even contemplate perhaps being disruptive, being a problem. So, you know, that, you know, I'll just go. When I was an undergraduate at the UBC, I studied early modern French history because that was history. Like, I know it, isn't it laughable? Like, when I say that now, it's sort of like, I went to grad school to be an early modern French historian. And I remember going through the stacks and wanting to leave and just go to law school. That's how bad it was, that I thought law school would be better. And then I found the section, you know, of journals, Amerasia Journal. They had the Asianadian, and I was going, oh, this is much more interesting. And then I went again. I had to convince, I think, the professors at that time that I could do something interesting with this. And they're sort of, fortunately, they didn't care. Probably there's benign neglect. They didn't care enough to actually check into whether this is real history or not. And I say all this with half-hearted humor, because in some sense, to get to the point where you could then actually do, you know, research without the scrutiny, without the kind of question, without the things that Mona so powerfully raised. I think that is the problem, is our institutions still weed out and say, you're going to be supported because you do what we want you to do. This other set, they're not scholars, they can't be scholars, they have no potential to be scholars. It is something that requires institutional change. It requires that vote to be different. To use a different metaphor, you know, we talked about getting a seat at the table and representation, but actually governance, accountability, resources is about changing the table itself. You know, that you can't just have a seat on the table. This is a very unique table, you know, and it's been such an enjoyable conversation, even though I'm not Japanese Canadian in any sense, and I'm not of the Japanese Canadian communities that have developed over 100+ years. And yet the discussions we've been having are about, again, the institutions that are causing the harm. You know, just as racism isn't about anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Indigenous racism, as if it's the targeted groups, it's about white supremacy. You know? And so in that sense, I think if there is lessons learned about, and full disclosure, I was an advisor, an arm's length advisor to the Landscapes of Justice. That came after they were already funded. And the very first meeting I remember, I'll reveal, this is not in camera anymore, there were two Japanese American scholars I highly respect, Gary Okuhiro and Ichiro Azuma, who were also on advisory. And the very first question that Gary Okuhiro asked was, Landscapes of Injustice, what does justice mean in this project? And there was no answer. And at that point, Ichiro didn't show up to another meeting. Gary and we talked afterwards, and he said, should we resign now or later? And it was, and I remember saying, let's see at least if there can be any kind of silver linings out of this. Can we get some good out of this by forcing? And for the next 4 years of my life, I spent so much time, rather than doing work with my own communities and my own research, just trying to make sure that there was less harm in that project. And after a while, I just thought, no, it's impossible. I can't do it anymore. And so Gary quit earlier. He just came to one more meeting and he said, I'm out of here. I regret not publicly coming out and saying, this has to, it wasn't my place as an arm's length advisor. It had to come in some sense, in an impossible way from the community itself to say, you know, but, you know, we talk about when can you say no, right? There was, and whether there were actually people within the museum world and others that quite rightly, I think they were also trying to get some good out of it. So I think this is the problematic thing about people being pitted against each other. That was what was really horrifying to me and kept me up at nights, and why I kept trying to help a process that was flawed structurally from the beginning and was not salvageable in the long term. But yeah, so I think that's depressing. It depressed me. I'm here not to sort of like complain. I'm here to say unless you change the structures, then those are not going to, the outcomes aren't going to be different.
Thank you, Henry. There's a follow-up comment on what you're saying, that there are also a number of Japanese Canadian scholars who raised alarm bells early regarding the project, and no one listened, is the comment. I have there are actually quite a few questions here and very little time, so I'm just going to jump into another question. I'm sorry if I'm cutting anybody off. There's someone says, I'm a graduate student in a discipline that straddles practice and academia, which is urban planning. Do you have any advice for a student such as myself who wants to integrate reciprocity into consultation with Indigenous, racialized, equity-seeking groups in a discipline that is often extremely transactional and does not reward emotional labor or knowledge sharing?
That's a tough one. I mean, I don't have a good sense of urban planning as a discipline. I do know one thing, that in a sense, the work I've done and the ability to be able to say that relationship is important. I've been supported by the discipline I've chosen to go in, which is initially social work, then to a certain extent, education. However, even in those two disciplines, it's been really challenging because it's just seen as soft research, or you're not seen as doing legitimate research, so on and so forth. So yeah, what are some wilderness tips in terms of reciprocity and disciplines that are particularly challenging? Well, the only thing I can say is, and I want to just to bring in that I do agree that we do need to have changes to the structure, because if we do want to support academics who are coming up through the ranks, particularly in universities, the structures that we currently exist in universities, they work to keep diversity out.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, in some senses, hopefully that if there's enough of a critical voice within universities, we can change things. But as someone once said in a research project that I did many years ago, and I quote the person said, maybe we just have to blow the whole thing up. But as an interim measure, we have to have a voice at the table, and then basically start saying the table needs changing, or just maybe it's blowing it up, or maybe it's not even a table anymore. Maybe it's a circle without tables. But I think generally, just speaking, that the best we can do on an individual level is to practice it ourselves. Even if we know that it's going to be challenging, and try and find those who support the work that we do in reciprocity. So for example, this is a real excellent instance of communities supporting each other who want to do research in a different way. And so we have to reach out, and we have to just continue to work from our values, work from our principles, and not necessarily give in to all of the benefits and all of the carrots that can, I think, be offered to us as researchers from the margin, because it's very tempting these days. It's tempting to maybe do things in a more transactional basis, rather than just coming from our values, our principles, and doing the hard work of just trying to stay true to those. My
Thank
kick
you.
at the can.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
I think what Margaret is saying is, I don't really know if I can add to it. Because reciprocity, it seems to me, is something that you really have to think about. And it's not necessarily something that can just be told to you, this is what it is. The context is going to matter. For instance, in my day job, I sometimes work with an Indigenous organization here in Ontario. And one of the things that was put to me is that in working with them, we're past the stage of including them in an advisory capacity. They're not advisors anymore. That's not adequate. That partnership is really what we're trying to achieve. And, I can't necessarily define what partnership is, but I think that it's sort of implied in some of what people have already said today, in the sense that, for instance, people have to be at the table from the beginning. The discussions have to take place before the funding has come in. And I think that I think if you think closely, I'm speaking to the questioner here, if you think closely about what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and you think closely about what that conversation and that partnership really requires, I think you can probably get to what it is that you want. I think the other thing is if you're working with an organization, you may just want to say, like, what does partnership look like if we're going to engage in this process? I think that that's probably a good starting point.
I'm gonna jump in here with another question. There are two comments and questions here that are both about the Landscapes of Injustice Projects database. They're saying that while there is value for individual Japanese Canadians and being able to access their family records and history through this database, there is a dynamic of present with these individual records being available for the public to see, and for researchers to use this information to study individual Japanese Canadian lives as research objects. They want to know if there are thoughts about this. The other one about the database says, there has been disruption in my family due to archives that were opened and put online into the public sphere, including some very personal letters and information. I understand this is a common experience. My mother, who was born during the internment, is experiencing emotional trauma from some of the things she saw online, some for the first time. This information has been quickly spreading through my extended family, and now there is what I might characterize as a kind of collective shock and silence. I'm hearing some allusions to this research, but is there a place for non-academic community members and elders to find a way to talk about this or to find action on this? And for elders who aren't already involved in, quote unquote, the community that is being alluded to, how do we deal with the damage that has been done? I'm going to jump in right here for 1 second and say that I had started a ball rolling in having community conversations just among ourselves to talk about that trauma together and support each other. But anyways, I will contact this person. But does anyone want to speak to this?
I just want to say, I think that speaks so eloquently and in such a terrifying way to how outside researchers are using our material, and just thinking that these records can be just shared as if there's no issues around re-experiencing the violence and unresolved issues within the community. And it just perfectly illustrates the lack of care, the lack of any understanding. And even if there was an agreement more widely about sharing this material, Jennifer, I know you have some very interesting thoughts and about what's entailed in doing that work, and how I think, yes, I don't know if you want to see more about that, because what you try to do is very instructive about even the challenge of doing that when you have a large, well-funded organization that's sort of mining the community for experiences and trying to control every aspect of our dialogue. And in every aspect of our relations around our history.
Thank you, Kirsten. We have time for one last comment. It's going to be from Mona.
I'll be
Okay.
quick. Let me gather my thoughts. I mean, this goes back to my point about the effects on people of this research. And I know a bit about the history. I don't know anything about the database because I've had nothing to do with that project. But I know, working for a long time at the Library and Archives Canada, that I think that's how they were procured. And in fact, Library Archives Canada was not allowing people to access like the custodian records for privacy reasons, right? And I kind of fought them on that just to get my parents' records, but I wrote a bit about that in the book. But you know, what I argued in my book, as I found letters that were censored, et cetera, was actually those records belong to us. They were kept on us by the state, like thousands of pages that were kept on us and our families, every movement, you know, wherever they were moved, and, you know, what chattels were taken from them, right? And those documents belong to us. A researcher cannot come along and say, you know, as Henry said, I've discovered them. There are documents. And I think maybe, you know, we, among everything else we have to think about, that's about understanding that and, you know, claiming them in ways that are ethical for our community, right? And also deciding who uses them. And for what purpose, right? So that's just my response.
Thank you, Mona. That actually speaks to what you were saying, Dr. Kovach, about OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession for Indigenous data and Indigenous knowledge being owned by communities. And that is a whole other area for discussion and concern. We have 2 minutes. I don't know how you would like to address the 2 minutes, but or what, but I'm going to use this moment to say thank you. Does anybody want to say any final comments, words?
Just one final word about, I'm just picking up from Mona and Margaret's, that control of knowledge is really, I'd say, the most important thing. That's nothing about us without us is a very, you know, pretty snappy way of saying it. But that was at the heart of the problems, is that open access. If it's going to be digitized, it has to be open to everyone. This is this ideology of once it's out, it's out. We know that for Indian residential schooling records, that's not going to work, so it doesn't happen. And yet, this idea that you can make knowledge and then with no sense of responsibility, just throw it out there. There was one stream of research which I tried to squash, and one of the reasons why I stuck in there was, I tried to squash this, was who benefited from dispossession and liquidation and sales. And it was a research question. We're going to find out who all the, now, if you know anything, if you just dig all that out and throw it out there, you have no idea what you're doing. And so that to me just showed their irresponsibility of, there should have been all kinds of controls about review. What's it for? If we're going, so we need disaggregated data or else we won't know the effects on racialized communities and those, you know, so the idea that privacy, we can't show and share data, that's been used against and weaponized against, you know, racialized communities. And yet, just because we create disaggregated data, if it's in the wrong hands, it's even worse. And so we are in this place where who has say and accountability, governance over knowledge that's created about communities. Nothing about us without us. That, it seems to me, it's fairly straightforward.
Dr. Kovach, do you have final thoughts, or please?
Well,
please share.
I just want to say very briefly how absolutely honored I am to be here today.
And this dialogue has been, in so many ways, it's been challenging because a lot of what I've heard today, we've had conversations within Indigenous community, and they're conversations that they're hard conversations to have. And that the way forward is that it's going to take a lot of work, but we're in it together. And I think to me, it's always good to know that we have other communities that we can have these conversations with and know we're not alone. And so that's really important. But with that being said, as I say, miigwech, and thank you so much. As they say in the West Coast, Haichka Siam. I've just been so honored to be here today, but I would like to give space to the new day, the academics that are coming in, yeah. So I'm just going to.
Miigwech, thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
I am the new day. I guess what I'll say really quickly with this is that despite the fact that we've talked about so many different, very concerning, very disturbing, and very historically problematic and continuing problematic parts of our community, I don't want this event for us to end on a negative note. Because the sheer facts that that ours to tell exists is evidence that that's not the only way forward in our community and not the only way forward in writing our history. The fact that we've been so lucky to have Professor Kovach with us today as part of our discussion is evidence that our communities have the possibility to work together outside of this idea of traditional centralized white history and create stories and histories which are just as uniquely Canadian as anything that you would necessarily see published within a museum. The fact that we need to be concerned about the information out there shows that people want that information and that there's a demand for it. Something that is incredible to think of when you think of the history of how we were allowed to be proud of our community, even 20, 30 years ago. I think that we should, well, it's very important that we need to keep examining what's going on, and we always should do that, because if not, then you become stuck in very passive ways of allowing outdated traditions to continue and continue, especially in history. I think that the fact that it's so precedent and it's so important and urgent right now is actually a very, very positive side for the community. I mean, in the 1940s, the government tried to destroy our communities. They tried to pull our communities apart. There is no Japantown. But I think events like this and conversations like this show that they did not succeed. And they will not succeed with the next generation as well.
That is a great note to end on. Thank you, Bailey. Thank you, everyone, for spending time with us today online and in person. It's been a great honor to listen to everybody speak today. There's so much here for us to reflect on and to bring forward into new work and new ways, and to stay together, to keep together.